We're passing out handouts for a Presbyterian timeline from the late 1500s into the 1600s. And it has to do with this assigned message, has to do with our theme of United in Christ. And this is really just more of a lesson on how we are united to the Presbyterians who went before, especially the English and Scottish and Irish Presbyterians. And so there are timelines there, and just for some interest. But I'll be talking about from the Old World, which is really Old Britain, coming to New Britain or New England in the New World. And I'll spend quite a bit of time on Old England as far as how those Presbyterians drank from the stream. And when you and I drink from the stream, we want to remember the source of where our blessings, our light come from. And we know that God is the author of all these good things. But the stream that the English Presbyterians drank from was from Geneva. And Geneva worked it out. The Lutherans really never worked out their system of government or didn't refine their worship too much beyond what they had inherited. But there was a real Reformation in Geneva, and the English Presbyterians, the Puritans, tried to build on that and develop it further. And that's the foundation that we're built upon here in our American Presbyterianism. When you drink from the stream, remember the source. And we're talking about Providential Presbyterianism, especially in America. And it fits a theme of why the Presbyterians came to the New World, is much like the Apostolic period. See the famous verse in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, we know that, but we also know Acts chapter 8, verse 1, which says that the disciples had been around Jerusalem, but they began to be scattered, and when they were scattered, verse 4 says, they went about preaching the word, chapter 8, verse 4. This is our heritage of English Presbyterianism and Scottish Presbyterianism. When they were persecuted, they began to be scattered. So that most of the Scots and most of the English Puritans who came to the New World came as dissidents because they were not tolerated, especially under Charles I and Charles II. Great persecution in that time, and great resistance also under King James before those two Charles kings. And so, interesting blessing, interesting providence, how God works to move people out of their comfort zone. So, on the one side, we've got a picture of the apostle preaching, and on the right side, we've got a picture of proto-Puritan, what we call John Knox, a Puritan trying to purify the Church of England as a representative of the Scottish Reformation, but he's in the vanguard, Knox. And so I'm just looking for a picture of John Knox as a model for the other Puritan preachers in England and Ireland wanting to reform the Irish church, Irish and English church. We just give a tip of the hat to the Waldenses. The Waldenses, before the Reformation in Geneva or the German Reformation, the Waldenses were already gospel preachers, and they already had a limited form of Presbyterian government where they recognized that the elders ought to be, who knew the Word of God, ought to be the preachers of that. So those barbies, those elders, were set apart by their church communities. And then another big Presbyterian thing that they tried to practice was a synod, sitting together. Synod means sitting together. They would try to do that once the snows melted in the Piedmont and the valleys there between Italy and the Riviera of France. They gather in those deep valleys of the Alps, in the foothills at least up there, and have meetings to say, how are we going to deal with strictures, with persecutions, and shepherd the flock. So they believed in being connected. And you saw that word connectionalism already in our synod docket, wanting to be connected as a true Church of Christ. We got also a note there on the Heinrich Bullinger. we're very appreciative of Heinrich Bullinger, successor to Zwingli, and Bullinger did a great work for Reformed faith with his second Helvetic Confession, but also in promoting Presbyterian government. So Geneva, we looked at Geneva and John Calvin's Reformation and others there as the fountainhead of renewed Presbyterian polity. If you've been to Geneva, Switzerland, you know that that fountain is spraying 24/7 there in Lake Geneva with the city right there on the edge of the lake. But there's always a chain where God is doing something in people's lives. And God did something in John Knox's life. He brought Bloody Mary to the throne. And John Knox had to get out of town to save his life. He found sanctuary in Geneva. He was a pastor to the English-speaking congregation, the English Puritans that were in Geneva, who had also fled Mary. But he was impressed and picked up on the biblical training on here's true worship, and here's how Christ governs the church through these representative elders. Knox's successor was Andrew Melville. And we have a minister in our, not in our midst, but in our denomination, who almost came, and that's Tim Prussick. And another almost went. He almost went to Scotland to major in the writings of Andrew Melville. And Melville went way beyond John Knox in writing down, developing, promoting Presbyterian church government. When John Knox was in Scotland, thundering from the pulpit, they established a Reformation church in Scotland, but they still had bishops. But when Melville came, they went further, and then they had full Presbyterian government under Andrew Melville with the second book of discipline. He did not get along with King James VI in Scotland. King James VI passed something called the Black Acts in Scotland, pushed that through the Parliament, they rubber stamped it, and it shut down ongoing Reformation efforts of Knox and Melville. And then that King James VI became King James I in England, and he took control over England, Scotland, and Ireland, those British Isles. So after Andrew Melville, we looked at a man named Thomas Cartwright. I'll have more to say about him, but each of these had some connection with Geneva. Knox with Calvin, Melville, Cartwright with Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor there in Geneva, and they went to study the Bible together, but also to sit at the feet of the Genevan reformers. English Presbyterianism, we're talking about the Puritans. And it's good to remember that most of the English Puritans were Presbyterian in their sympathies. They were sympathetic with the Genevan Reformation. And so in the 1500s, when we talk about Puritans in the 1500s who were trying to call for more reforms under Queen Elizabeth, most of those reformers, Puritans, were Presbyterian. Most were. The Congregationalist Puritans really came in the 1600s. And the quote at the bottom of the screen here is a paraphrase of what the Westminster Assembly did in 1645. And as much as the Westminster Assembly is fighting against bishops and prelates in the Church of England, because the Westminster Assembly was a Puritan operation and produced Puritan documents, they were also against not only bishops, but they were also against Congregationalism. And they viewed Congregationalism as being schismatic. It's our four and no more. So we're going to break from other believing churches. In fact, if you come into our congregation here in London, we're Congregationalists here, and we don't know you, you can't have the Lord's Supper with us. And so, talk about unity in Christ. I think the Puritan Presbyterians had a right approach to that there's a larger regional church, and therefore you need a Presbyterian system to recognize that and organize it as well. So Puritanism addressed the unfinished Reformation in England, but Presbyterian Puritanism addresses the abuses of the Erastian Church of England. and the Erastian church just means a state church. You've got a state church and a church state. And the Presbyterians were saying, we don't want the king and his bishops telling us how to do church. We want godly men who understand their people in the congregation. We want them ruling the church. And we're so much closer to the people, and those people will follow their elders as the elders follow Christ. So that's what they read in the Bible. Here's Thomas Cartwright, real champion in Elizabethan England. He died just about the same year that King James came to replace Elizabeth in London, and studied at Cambridge, and he was the foremost Presbyterian apologist at Cambridge. And are you aware that most all of the Puritans took their training at Cambridge? So not at Oxford, but Cambridge was the bastion of Reformation doctrine. And that's where most were trained there. So he ran into, because of his ideas and his writings, he's a professor there. So he trains there, and then he becomes a professor there. And the vice chancellor is an Anglican, who will later become the Archbishop of Canterbury. That Anglican vice regent is trying to shut him down all the time, squelch his writings, his teachings at Cambridge, trying to get him kicked out. And finally, he loses his position because of that prosecution. But he's, and then later on, he will be brought before the Star Chamber, which was just a quasi-inquisition of the Church of England, to say you're heretical. Well, you're not heretical, but you're a seditionist. You're against the king as the head of the church. And so he faced a lot of trials for the sake of Christ. Just listed some of his objections. These points are his writings. That's the way he wrote them. Just the spelling's been updated. But objections to prelacy and then raising Presbyterian demands, I'll just let you look at that for a minute. With the idea that when we talk about prelacy, we're talking about Episcopalianism with bishops and archdeacons and so forth. But he says, I don't see archbishops in the Bible. I don't see archdeacons in the Bible. He says, what's wrong with the apostolic model, number 2? Number three is at the crux of everything. Should we be responsible, how we operate church, responsible for the king and the king's hirelings? Or should it be spiritual men who are closer to people? How about number 5? Are you aware that if you were born into an aristocratic home in that era, if you're the firstborn son, then you might go off into the military or the Navy, but if you're a second-born son, then you go into the church. And there were so many mercenary candidates applying for the Church of England, the job. You get a cushy job, we just go through the motions and read the prayer book Sunday after Sunday, and you can climb the hierarchical ladder. Maybe you'll become a bishop. Maybe you'll become an archbishop or an archdeacon and get a pension. So no man ought to solicit that. And solicit means maybe solicit with money, solicit with a bribe, and pay off to get into the prelacy. Here's a picture of modern-day prelates, and they're a fun-looking bunch. But I learned something in studying about the old world. But prelate comes from the Latin word to prefer, and it really strikes against our Reformation doctrine of the individual priesthood of believers. We all are equal at the foot of the cross, and we have different giftings, and some people are just stand out, better to let's let them talk first because they know what they're talking about. But as far as preference, we've got some concern about that. So coming back to Cartwright, he's promoting Presbyterianism by training students at Cambridge, by his writings, and his apologetic work for Presbyterianism is called Holy Discipline, subscribed by 500 Puritan ministers. But Church of England said, this strikes at the establishment, it strikes at the status quo, and it's dangerous to have this in print. And they began ferreting out copies of this Holy Discipline because it was pro-Presbyterian. Now, I found this interesting. By 1644, all the copies have disappeared, but there's still some memory. And the Westminster Divines are saying, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but somebody did the heavy lifting for us, and that was this guy named Thomas Cartwright. He died 40 years earlier. Can't we find a copy of that? And they found a copy at his home long after he had died. He must have secreted that, hidden that copy somewhere, and then the family brought it out later after he died, and that was republished. But do you see the last lines there? They were so anti-papacy. Let's see. Yeah, the days of Queen. Okay, they were anti-papacy and pro-Presbyterian. But anyway, I think what I'm grasping for is that last line. For such a time as this, Westminster Assembly looking to advance the biblical reformation of the continent into the British Isles, and that means proper worship and proper government and stewardship of the church. And so they said, this thing's a gem, and they republished it. So he's not only teaching and publishing where he can, but because he's in hot water, he can't be too vocal around London. He says, I'm going to go over to British-owned islands off of France. And so he's planting Presbyterianism, first of all, in England. So just southwest of London, the first presbytery is established in his lifetime. And so it's pretty informal because Queen Elizabeth hasn't banned Presbyterianism, but several Church of England congregations have gotten together saying, well, hey, we're Puritan, we belong to the Church of England, but we want to be able to fellowship as Presbyterians and govern ourselves. And so it was kind of a bit of an underground presbytery. Then at Cambridge, they had their first synod, but then going to those Channel Islands. And here's a picture of the Channel Islands where they are. So Guernsey and Jersey Islands, we get New Jersey in the New World, named after Old Jersey. Let's see where we are here. And Guernsey, so they must have named those two islands after the cows of that region, the Guernseys and the Jerseys. But he was there. And there were Huguenots there. You see Le Havre there, just to the east of Guernsey. There's Le Havre, former stronghold of the Huguenots. And the Huguenots have been harried out of France. Some of them are going to the English Channel Islands there. And so he organized, and the Huguenots said, we believe in the Reformation, we want Presbyterian government. Cartwright went and helped them with that. So Cartwright, in his lifetime, was working with Walter Travers, and Travers went over to Ireland. We're talking Dublin. We're not talking Northern Ireland. We're talking Dublin, because the Church of England is controlling Ireland. And the Church of England is in Ireland. And so this Travers, who's a Presbyterian, Puritan, he trains James Usher. And you've heard that name Usher, right? Usher's, one of your old Bibles might say, Genesis chapter 1, 4004 BC. That's based on the chronology of Archbishop Usher. He was one of the first to work on that chronology. But anyway, Usher has Puritan sympathies, and he's trained by Walter Travers at Trinity College in Dublin. And then James Usher really bought into it. You can see there, under his name, he becomes the protector, patron of the Puritans. And so now they're still within arm's reach of the king and of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but there's water in between. And so not everything that's done, in church over here in Ireland, over there in Ireland, not everything is reported back. So there'll be a lot of Puritans that leave London to go to Dublin. And then later on, Puritans will be going up to Belfast and up north Ulster. So English Presbyterianism spreads to Ireland, and I didn't know Ireland had its own parliament. 1615, King James he's the king, the august king of Scotland, Britain, and Scotland, England, and Ireland, those three main isles. Scotland had a parliament. England had an occasional parliament, they called. Ireland had a parliament. And they said, the other churches have their doctrinal statements. Why can't we have ours? And so they commissioned that out of the Parliament of Ireland, and they tasked Archbishop Usher to write the Articles of Religion of the Church of Ireland. And I never knew that became one of the bases of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Don't reinvent the wheel, but we'll take the structure of that and move on from there. So we're talking about, the providential connections of English people and Scot people meeting reformers in Geneva. And then it spreads back to Scotland, spreads back to London, and Cambridge, and then it spreads now to Dublin in the 1600s especially. And it's going to really take root in Ulster and Belfast up north. Here's a picture of North Ireland. Those red counties are what's called Ulster, the plantation. So this is King James's idea, especially he comes to power around when? 1604. But by 1609, he says, I want my own Scottish people, I want them to come down from Scotland and move into North Ireland to help pacify the Roman Catholic elements of Ireland. And so, not real readable, that small print there, but King James was no friend of Presbyterianism. He says monarchy and Presbyterianism agree as much as God and the devil. And he was a monarch, and he believed in divine right, so he's against Presbyterianism. So initially he starts this colony in North Ireland with the idea of granting relief to northern Englishmen who were victim to raiders coming out of Scotland. But then who comes down but the Scottish Presbyterians into Ireland, especially because of King James's persecutions. So it's an interesting irony. Not only Scots came to Ulster, Huguenots came to Ulster. Salzburgers, Lutherans came to Ulster in those early days. And so it was a haven for Reformation worship and belief in Northern Ireland. Ian Paisley comes from Ulster, Northern Ireland. And years ago, we had Ian Paisley address this body up in, was that Knoxville? Yep. Knoxville area. So the rest of us, we're more familiar with the Solemn League and Covenant, just to refresh some of your church history training. About 1643, where there's a tug of war going on between Charles I, that's the king that lost his head to Cromwell, and the Parliament. Tug of war between the King Charles I and the Parliament that did not want to dissolve. And so the Scottish says, we will help the Parliament if the Parliament will work on reforming the Church of England. And so that's the Solemn League and Covenant is between Scotland and the Parliament of England. And one of the things that came out of that Parliament then was, okay, we've got the Solemn League and Covenant, we're going to commission a Westminster Assembly, Westminster Abbey. So I hope you get a chance to visit Westminster Abbey if you haven't been there, and visit a historic place for Presbyterians. So this was the quote I was looking for. The bottom line here, the Solemn League and Covenant, it wants to endeavor the extirpation of popery, and prelacy in the three kingdoms. And then the end of Puritan Presbyterianism in England came after Cromwell had tried to, establish a big change in the Church of England. And when he died, there was no succession after Cromwell, and King Charles II comes back. And you can see what happened in 1661, 1662. Some of the Puritan authors we like Thomas Watson, Goodwin, others, they were thrown out of the church, out of the parsonage, no more salary. They were just because their flocks loved them, the people fed them and housed those pastors, those Puritans. But it's very tough times. And then Parliament was forced by King Charles to end organized Presbyterianism in England. This is after the Westminster Assembly trying to introduce and impose Presbyterianism. And no private meetings. That's a conventicle. No underground church, no private meetings in homes, and because that's seditious against the Church of England. And so here's a believer, John Bunyan. He says, I've got this fire burning inside of me. I have to preach. And he said, I'd rather go to jail than to stop preaching. It's kind of like Jeremiah chapter 20, where God says, I just want to stop preaching, but I can't. I've got the word of life, and it's got to come out. It's like a fire in my inward side. And so the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary coming in 1688 made a big difference. And it's a new generation of Puritans. And they've been fighting, they've been persecuted for 100+ years. And because James II on his throne there, I beg your pardon, that's Charles II on the throne up here. His brother, James II, comes to the throne after him. James is talking about recalling, reintroducing a Roman Catholic Church. And Puritans said, okay, as long as you tolerate us and give us licenses to preach and organize churches outside of the Church of England, we'll be happy. If we may not be the government of the Church of England, but at least we'll be able to worship according to conscience. And so there were troublesome times. Any thoughts or comments up to that point? Because it's just more of a lesson rather than a sermon here. So we're talking about the unity with our forefathers. So there's this providential transition from the old world to the new. Of course, that's going to come with persecution. The New World is settled largely by the Brits, Scots, Irish. And it's one of those early Puritan governors that talks about that out of a winter snowstorm blossomed a Reformation church in the New World. And it's a beautiful image of people coming, wanting freedom of conscience, and worshiping God according to the Bible. Some of the early Presbyterians in America, Alexander Whitaker, his father taught at Cambridge. He was a Puritan at Cambridge. And he's called the Apostle of Virginia. So Virginia's the first. I mean, we've heard about 1619. Well, I'm here to tell you about 1614. And he's the first there. He says, I'm going to go, and the charter of the Virginia company said, hey, we're going to do this not just for making money with tobacco and corn, but we're going to evangelize the Indians as well. And Whitaker realized that. So I'm going to go, I'm going to do that. But his first calling was to the colonists, the people that went there to get a foothold in the New World. Even the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Massachusetts Bay becomes Congregationalist. They're still Puritan, but they're Congregationalist, anti-Puritan. But initially, that was a Presbyterian venture. Presbyterian investors said, let's establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a toehold there to promote Reformation churches. 1634 is a huge year. Archbishop Laud, if you remember that name, Laud, he's going to lose his head once Parliament and Cromwell win the day on the field of battle. But, that archbishop, because of his treachery, persecution, lost his head, but not before hundreds leave for the New World. And some of those Puritans went to Ulster, many came to Massachusetts and Virginia and Maryland. And then 1640, you can see, we're talking about New England now, in the 1640s. What they're doing with the Westminster Assembly in England is, people of Boston and Massachusetts and Cambridge, they want to, live free and worship God, but the deliberations of the Westminster Assembly are beginning to percolate over. And so the leaders are saying, well, 10 years ago we committed to Congregationalism, and now we're talking Presbyterianism, so it was a bit of a controversy just for a while. But the nice thing is that the later Puritans in Massachusetts did support and promote Presbyterian missionaries coming in the other colonies. Not in Massachusetts so much, but in Long Island, New York, New Jersey. If we can help you, you need churches down there. If it's Presbyterian, that's fine. Just don't bring Presbyterian churches back to Massachusetts. You might have heard the name Thomas Hooker. If anybody has Connecticut roots, he's one of the founders of Connecticut. A Puritan, trained at Cambridge. And he was not happy in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just how the civil government was going, and was still closely tied to the church there. And so he said, we're going to go down the Connecticut River and plant a new colony. And so it was New Haven Colony, and then the Connecticut colony that Hooker was associated with. But he appreciated, he would have made a good Bible Presbyterian, because it was consociationalism, which we understand, it's not just association, but con means to be identified with, work with, but maybe not be totally accountable to. I'm bringing this up to say, in our form of government, you can pull your congregation out at any time. And I think that's biblical. If your people invest in your property and in the life of your church, I like that idea. Not to say that that's consociation as opposed to association, but you know the name John Eliot? Missionary to the Indians, thoroughly Presbyterian, and he got that out of the Bible, especially the New Testament, and he wrote about his system for church government and gave most of his life to learning the language of the local Indians and organizing them and saying, here's the biblical government. There were some transplants out of Connecticut down to Newark, and we know later pastor at Newark was this guy named Aaron Burr, and then another church came to Elizabethtown. 1670s, the Crown finds out that, man, there's some real Reformation going on in Ulster. They're not real happy with the Church of England and Ulster. I'm talking late 1600s now. And so they started tightening the screws on the Puritans in Ulster. And so many of them went to the New World. And you can see where they landed, Maryland, Virginia. I'd never heard of the Eagle's Wings ship. A little bit bigger than the Mayflower, but this is the last attempt to leave Ulster, the Puritans leaving Ulster in 1736. And they left too late. They left in September. By November, the Atlantic Ocean was so rough. Halfway across the ocean, they turned around and said, we don't know how far this new world is. And they turned around. But the other thing, we're going to hear about McKemey tomorrow. But the other thing that drove dissidents to the New World is the killing times under King James II. Increase Mather, he's one of those later sympathetic Puritans that we will support Presbyterian works in Maryland, Virginia. If we can send trained ministers from Harvard to go down, we'll do that. And they'll be able to work with the dissidents down there at Winning Presbyterian Church. And so, increase, he had a famous father, John, Richard Mather was his father, but his father-in-law was John Cotton. And John Cotton is one of the thinkers behind Congregationalism in Boston. But Increase Mather realized the importance of accountability and connectionalism outside of your own congregation. And just wrapping up with implications of the Presbyterian migration, there's some rough seas that these hardy people ventured across to live free before the Lord. We've been talking about connectionalism, number one. Subpoint 1, an earnest effort by Presbyterians to gather spiritually hungry sheep in the colonial wilderness. And a lot of those people were agrarian in the colonial times. So you might just have a small village, who knows how many families, 5 families, but most everybody was trying to carve something out of the wilderness. So they're living out in an agrarian area. The Presbyterian and Puritan pastors that went over tried to gather them, say, you need to recognize yourself as a sheep of Christ. And people were ready for that. So, yeah, we're pretty isolated here. We need to be connected. And then number 2, Presbyterians being zealous for the whole counsel of God, but also believing in divine immediacy. Trust the providence of God. God is in this. If this is God honoring, God will be in it. They would step out and stick their necks out. John Eliot had a burden for the Native Americans around Cape Cod and that area. Thirdly, Presbyterians live by the gospel. Many pastors gladly would participate in the First Great Awakening in the next century after many of these people came to the New World. Number 4, they're looking for a biblical mode of worship. And they had not found it in England. But you can see the subpoints there. Great participation in America's cause for freedom and independence. It's on record that 2/3 of the colonial army were Scotsmen, most of them from Ulster. A few of those Scotsmen from Scotland, but most came by way of Ulster. And so you're going to see, here's the need, why there's going to be a need for a Francis McKemmy to come and gather and shepherd those Scotsmen who are coming across in the late 1600s. And then number 5 is kind of telling, here's the whole struggle. Here's what the whole Reformation was about. Who's in charge of the Church of Christ? And the Bible says, Christ is. Christ is in charge. And then it's governed and directed by the deputies of Christ who are duly recognized. These are the elders, teaching elders and ruling elders that are close to the people and rise up from among those people as leaders, care for the people. This is a concluding slide that the fruit of all these labors and the risks that were taken in the 1600s came to fruition with somebody like John Witherspoon. He's the first moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, USA, 1789. And there's a sermon text. And we look at that text and we say, you and I, we've got a sense of connection to our forebears who struggled and suffered a lot more than we do. And John Witherspoon also, he knew what had gone before him in the New World there. He knew the struggles, the tears, persecutions of McKemmy and so forth. He says, but God was in it all. And so we venture everything